Dear rabbis, board members, congregants, friends, and family, when our Darchei Noam president, Hai Eliasov, called us about being this year's Chatan Torah and Kala Breshit, we took some time to think about it before we accepted. We're very honored to have been selected, but frankly, it's not really our style to be front and center in terms of recognition. We believe in doing the right thing, but for its own sake, not for the kavod.
We also knew that we would be hard-pressed to tell you about our spiritual journey, since we are more driven by our Jewish identity, the people to whom we belong, than the purely religious aspects of Judaism. As we look around the sanctuary today, we feel deeply that we belong to this community. So our journey is about belonging and how a feeling of belonging has helped us to overcome challenges and provides a forum to celebrate our milestones and ultimately molds us into the people that we are today.
I was born in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, to parents who had also been born in Saskatoon, number 2 of 4 baby boom children. I've described our home as being filled with love, laughter, books, and high expectations. The Jewish community in Saskatoon was small, but it had a large profile. My father was a businessman and my mother a homemaker. They also both did a lot of high-level volunteer work in the Jewish and general communities. Although we weren't observant, Jewish holidays and the Jewish community were central to our lives. I was a reluctant student at our synagogue's after-school and Sunday morning Hebrew school. I didn't misbehave, but I practiced the passive resistance of inattention. My Hungarian teacher, for whom English was at least his 3rd language, once exclaimed that I was extinguished in the Rose family, by which he meant I was distinguished from my siblings who were all diligent and good students. But my basic identity was as a Jew. My best friends were Jewish, and we spent a lot of time with our extended family. I was often the only Jewish kid in my grade right through high school. I went to Camp B'nai B'rith in Alberta for many summers. I loved camp, loved my friends from other small communities, and marveled for at least the first week every summer that everyone was Jewish. I belonged to BBYO and eagerly took part in regional and district conventions. I had a bat mitzvah. It was on Friday at a Friday evening service, but the congregation was very progressive, and almost all the girls in the community had bat mitzvahs, beginning with my older sister. While I was growing up in a peaceful and prosperous prairie bubble, Les's early years were quite different.
I was born in Hungary to 2 Holocaust survivors, just 5 years after they were liberated from the concentration and slave labor camps. My father was ordained as a rabbi after the war in the Neolog tradition, which is the Hungarian equivalent of the conservative movement. And my mother, though trained as a nurse, was a teacher of Jewish children for most of her life. When I was 6 years old, the Hungarian Revolution upended the life of our family once again. Through a combination of bravery and sheer luck, my mother, my sister Judy, and I managed to escape and enter the United States as refugees, followed a few months later by my father. My parents went through the very challenging process of learning a new language and American customs, but after 1 year, Dad was hired to his first American pulpit in Massachusetts. That was the beginning of a series of moves to different cities every few years, until we settled in Manchester, New Hampshire when I started high school. You may not know Manchester, but it's a fun fact that comedian Adam Sandler grew up there, and my mother prepared him for his bar mitzvah. It was also in my early years in the US that I developed my love of baseball. It was one of the first things that I learned from my friends. I loved playing the game, its arcane rules and myriad statistics, and it was one of the first things that made me feel like an American and like I belonged. It was not easy being an immigrant, let alone the rabbi's son, often the only kid, or at least the only observant Jewish kid in school. I did make the best of it, though. I learned Hebrew at an early age. I could lead services from the time I was 10, and I even earned some spending money teaching other kids to prepare them for their B'nai Mitzvah. Similar to Toby, spending summers at Camp Ramah in Wisconsin and Massachusetts was one of the defining experiences of my youth. It also amazed me that everyone there was Jewish, and many of them were like me, proud Jewish kids who really loved all the Jewish stuff, not to mention all the Jewish girls. Another key experience for me was going to Israel for the summer when I was 16 years old and living with an Israeli family who did not speak a word of English. You know me well enough to know that I could not be silent all summer. But all the Torah and grammar that I had learned came in handy as my Hebrew improved by leaps and bounds. I also loved seeing and feeling Jewish history all around me. And again, I felt that far from being an outsider, this is a people and a place to which I belong.
When I spoke of my childhood, I mentioned high expectations. We were expected to live up to our abilities, maybe not at Hebrew school, but everywhere else. The same achievements were expected from the three of us girls, not just our brother. Our parents also wanted us to marry Jewish partners, and the likelihood of that was slim in Saskatoon. They encouraged us all to move to the big city to further our education and where there was a larger pool of potential candidates. When I was accepted to medical school in Saskatchewan, they were nervous that I would meet someone there, but I joined my siblings in Toronto after graduation and have lived here since 1977. While I was single, I would go to high holiday services at one synagogue or another, usually with my older sister. But like many young people, my formal attachment to the Toronto Jewish community came later, after I met Les on a blind date and we decided to get married.
I was lucky to be accepted to MIT, where I majored in architecture and mathematics. But with impeccable timing, I graduated in the middle of a recession caused by the Arab oil embargo that followed the Yom Kippur War. One of my friends told me that there was good work for architects in a place called Toronto, and it was a city just beginning to grow. I received 2 job offers, packed everything I owned into my baby blue AMC Gremlin, drove over the border, and moved here lock, stock, and barrel in 1975. I did not know a single person in the city when I arrived. However, I made friends and I enjoyed the adventure. It was at that point in my life that I also decided to move away from strict Jewish observance. I felt that I needed to open myself to more experiences than I had had until that time. I worked in an office for 3 years until I received my architectural license and then opened my own one-person practice. I had just hired my first employee when a friend set me up on a blind date with a beautiful, smart, witty, confident, and Jewish doctor, and we fell in love. It was on our first date that I realized how powerfully connected I felt with Toby as 2 young Jews, and realized that with her, I didn't have to explain myself and who I was. I think both Toby's parents and mine were equally thrilled, and maybe relieved as well.
Les and I first attended high holiday services at Darchei Noam at what was then the North JCC, around the corner from here, with my older sister and her husband. We were immediately drawn to Reconstructionism and the young rabbi, Richard Hirsch. Our brother-in-law, not so much. He delighted in referring to this congregation as the first place he ever saw a person wearing a kippah and a talit, breastfeeding a baby. We remember that at many of the early programs we attended, including one we hosted, people were asked what had drawn them to Darchei Noam. We were struck by how negative many of the reasons were, that they felt out of place at other synagogues and Jewish organizations and found it hard to feel that they belonged. We already had many other ties to the Jewish community, the Bloor JCC, Bialik Hebrew Day School, eventually Chat, UJA, missions to Israel, and we knew that we would always belong to a synagogue. We felt so lucky to have found Darchei Noam, where the liturgy and practices matched our own values. We're also proud that our 3 sons, Jonathan, Solomon, and Benjamin, all became B'nai Mitzvah at Darchei Noam on Hove Street. Benjamin's bar mitzvah was with Rabbi Grimberg soon after her arrival. In fact, Benjamin is one of only a few people who have had Rabbi Grimberg officiate at his bar mitzvah, his and Eden's wedding, and the Brit Milah of their son Asher. You could call that a rabbinic triple crown. Our boys have all chosen wonderful partners, Jonathan and Cassandra, who live in New York and who we just spent a week with in London, Solomon and Laura and their baby Julian, and Benjamin and Eden and their kids Asher and Isla. Too bad Asher isn't feeling well, so he and his mom stayed home. They were all amazing children and have grown up into terrific adults. We've been to Israel many times and maintain many long-term friendships there. There's even a group of my old friends from Saskatoon who made Aliyah in the early 1970s. Les refers to them as the Saskatoon Consulate. We've made 4 family trips there. In 1992 for 3 months, in 1995 for 5 weeks, followed by a family mission in the early 2000s, and then a 3-week stint in early 2023 during the demonstrations against the proposed judicial reforms, but before October 7th. Today, as we stand here, we share the hope of Jews worldwide and of all people of goodwill that this latest agreement will quickly bring home the hostages and lead to a secure and lasting peace.
We were drawn to Darchei Noam because the congregation shared many of our attitudes. We appreciated the intellectual rigor of Rabbi Hirsch and other rabbis who followed him, and the fact that many members of the congregation are well-versed Jewishly. They are rabbis, cantors, or like me, preachers' kids. Of course, egalitarian was a given. My father had introduced full participation of women to his conservative synagogue in the early 70s, and Toby's mother, Gladys, was the first woman president of a conservative synagogue in Canada, which became egalitarian under her tenure. As we said, we feel very much like we belong here. At the same time, it was a busy time of our lives. Toby's career as a forensic pathologist was demanding, and my office was growing and very busy. With 3 sons and their busy schedules, our volunteer work in the general community within each of our professions and Jewishly had to be focused and purposeful. We believe that volunteer work is an obligation of belonging, so we developed 4 rules for our volunteer activities. 1, the work had to have a clear purpose. 2, we had to be able to use our skills because we were not doing this just to have our names on a letterhead. 3, the work had to have a beginning and an end. And 4, we had to work with great people. When Darchei Noam found a new home in the basement of the B'nai B'rith building on Hove Street, I designed a multi-purpose space for our synagogue, which served us well until we outgrew it. When our sons were of bar mitzvah age, I also taught a 4-part class to the B'nai Mitzvah kids on Shabbat mornings, which I called Secrets of the Siddur. I told the kids that they were likely to go to many different synagogues during the course of the year, and if they paid attention, they would be able to figure out when the service would be over. We learned about the structure of the service from the Siddur's table of contents, about songs and choreography, about different traditions, and a little bit about Reconstructionism. And I was surprised by how many parents stayed for the sessions and participated themselves, never having been exposed to these ideas previously. I was also one of the Darchei Noam members who was asked to interview Tina Grimberg by telephone about becoming our rabbi. We spoke together, where is she? We spoke together for nearly an hour. And when we said goodbye, I turned to Toby and said, "What an extraordinary woman, rabbi, and teacher." As we have seen over the ensuing 25 years, Tina turned out to be all of that and so much more. We have been nurtured and cared for by her, and we will miss her, even as we build on her tremendous legacy and vision.
Among the many people who felt at home at Darchei Noam were Les's parents, Rabbi Joel and Ann Klein. For many years, they would travel to Toronto to spend Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur with us, and they got to know many congregants. When my mother moved to Toronto from Saskatoon to be closer to her children, she joined Darchei Noam, became an adult bat mitzvah, attended Shabbat services much more regularly than we did, and gained many friends and admirers. We were also happy to welcome my late sisters, Naomi with her husband Stan Sinai, and Kathy with her husband Jerry Cooper, and their kids to celebrate family events in our synagogue. Our niece, Mira Cates Rose, and her husband, Max Eves, and their son, Arthur, are now members of the congregation as well, and her parents, my brother David Rose and sister-in-law Marlene Cates, are regular visitors, along with their other kids and their families. I've been privileged to sit on the board twice under 4 different presidents: Meyer Simiaticki, Leanne Sharkey, David McKee, and Sylvia Hunter. Each time I was struck by how smart, devoted, and diligent all the board members and committee chairs are. Those of you who haven't been on the board or served on committees may not realize how much effort our clergy, staff, and volunteers put into every service, program, and administrative function. When I was asked to be the chair of the ritual committee, I really hesitated. I am far from a ritual expert, although I do live with one. My role was mostly as procedural chair. I was organized and enabled the committee to function and flourish. One of the things we accomplished was the purchase of the beautiful white Torah covers that we use at the high holidays. My medical career has been as a hospital and forensic pathologist. I feel that this work has a profound connection to Judaism, especially during the high holidays. The Unatana Tokef prayer evokes the vision of a book of life in which our names and fates are written for the coming year. The prayer can be translated: the course of every life is sealed. How many pass on? How many shall thrive? Whose death is timely and whose is not? We forensic pathologists answer questions about those unfortunate souls whose deaths are untimely and unexpected. Unatana Tokef ends by stating that righteous acts can avert the stern decree. I feel that the way that I and my colleagues act righteously is by approaching grieving families with respect and using our medical knowledge to provide answers for them, for the public good, and for the criminal justice system with whom we interact. Furthermore, it is traditional to read from Ecclesiastes during Sukkot, since it deals with themes of impermanence, and Sukkot are designed to be impermanent. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, is another connection to my work and the Jewish understanding of the world.
Belonging also brings with it responsibilities. We make regular donations to numerous Jewish organizations and causes. Early in our marriage, we became involved in UJA's leadership development program. At the very first meeting, I made the fatal error of suggesting a different arrangement of chairs, and shortly thereafter, I found myself having been appointed the chair. I also served on UJA board and various committees, most notably with Partnership 2000, which oversaw Toronto-sponsored social service projects in our Israeli twin cities, including Eilat and Bat Yam. I was also named the first UJA chair of Jewish continuity, through which I learned about and supported the amazingly broad spectrum of Jewish identity manifested in our diverse Toronto community. I believed then and believe now in the big tent vision of Jewish life, that we need to make our tent as large and inclusive as possible, and with as many entrances as possible, in order to maintain a vibrant life and a sense of belonging for us and future generations. This image resonates with me especially during Sukkot, when we purposely build a shelter with open sides as a sign of welcome.
We also support, and I sit on the board of Save a Child's Heart, an Israel-based charity that identifies and treats some of the innumerable children with congenital and rheumatic heart disease from many countries in the developing world, including many parts of Africa. Save a Child's Heart provides treatment for these children in Israel and sometimes in their home countries, and trains doctors and nurses from those regions so that they can return to their homelands and provide modern treatment there.
My architectural practice has grown from that one-person office when I met Toby. In 1986, my late partner and I put our two firms together to form Quadrangle. And in 2019, we joined one of the largest architecture and engineering firms in the United Kingdom and became BDP Quadrangle. With a staff of 200 in Toronto, we're now privileged to be part of one of the top 25 architectural firms in the world, with projects across the GTA, Ontario, Canada, the US, the UK, and around the globe. Even with all that in mind, perhaps the most meaningful involvement I have had with Darchei Noam was as the architect of this building. Toby jokes that I was the luckiest architect in the world because Darchei Noam's building committee may have been the largest in the 3,500-year history of the Jewish people. Seriously, it was an amazing experience to work together, build consensus, and put physical form to the ethos that makes Darchei Noam such a special community. Buildings house communities, but the hard part comes after trying to give a building a heart and a soul. The heart and soul of this building comes from those many of you, like us, who feel deeply a sense of belonging to this place and to this congregation. Thank you all for joining us today and honoring us in this way. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.